Welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I'm your host, Michael Manley, and I'm very happy to welcome Scott Faulkner this week to the podcast. Scott has had a really fascinating career as both a professional working musician and an executive director and arts leader. And I think it's the first time we've had somebody who's had that kind of career on the show. So I'm very eager to get into the mix of that with Scott and how he's managed both of those kind of big roles. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to see you. And I just wondered if you could give us a little bit of history about how you got into both of these paths as a musician and as a arts leader.
Yeah, it's funny. Life doesn't work out the way you think it will is one of the true statements that I've learned over time. I think that's probably true for everybody. I have always been a generalist. And when I was a student, I went to a liberal arts school and had an English lit minor and a music major. But I was always not just a sort of conservatory track specialist type person. And so I ended up coming to Reno for graduate school, thought I would be here for a couple of years and never ended up leaving. I got playing in the orchestras and was subbing regularly or was a non-contract regular sub in the chamber orchestra. And then I won the principal bass job in 1996 of the Reno Philharmonic. And so I've had that job for quite a while. And the chamber orchestra was coming out of a horrible case study situation where it almost went under. This was in the mid to late 90s, and stuff for another podcast of how people and musicians and everyone is treated and why good governance is important and all the rest. But as they were building and coming out of this, I got a halftime job as the artistic operations manager. Basically, they had enough resources, very small organization, to hire a halftime business person and a halftime everything else artistic side of things person. And so I was the music librarian and the personnel manager and set up chairs and stands and, kind of did all the stuff as it was just coming out of this near-death experience, and did that for a year. And then after a year's time, things were stabilizing. They wanted a full-time employee and they said, would you like to do that? And it happened to come with the biggest title. And so I sort of stumbled into this job. And at the time, I think the orchestra's budget was about $300,000. So it was a very small sandbox to learn these skills and different things. I was really fortunate. I hope we can talk about this more later on in the podcast. Fortunate that right about that time, I read about a seminar that the League of American Orchestras had called The Essentials of Orchestra Management. And I read the blurb and said, I need this. And so I went to the board chair and said, I need this. And she said, I agree. And they sent me to it. And it was the most important professional training really that I had in my career. And, since then I have gone to now lead the program and be on the faculty. So that's been a big and important and big joy in my life. But, I got those skills, but I was a bass player in the orchestra first. And so I was playing, everybody knew me as such. And then I got this job. So actually my friends and colleagues supported me greatly, as I sort of not just transitioned, but expanded what my presence was in the organization.
That's great. And so you mentioned that there was, a study, and there's been a lot of studies of orchestras, and they all seem to say orchestras don't make money or they're failing or something. But that actually isn't helpful information often.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so you had this budget of $300,000. What was the budget when you, I guess, left in 2015? Let's say
around $700,000. So it had more than doubled.
So how did you grow the orchestra, I guess, over time?
It was, just lots of good practices, I would say, partly because we were down to almost nothing. I mean, the orchestra was very close to shutting its doors at the time I took over. So we hired a music director who ended up being there for 15 or 16 years, Theodore Kuchar, and he was very ambitious and really improved the orchestra. And we went from single performances to doubles. Wow. And so that was a big step in the orchestra's evolution, because orchestras can't incrementally grow their capacity. You have to do it in 100% chunks if you add a show. So right. You can't add 50 seats. So that was a part of it. We grew the staff. We started the Nevada Chamber Music Festival, which has become an amazing international music festival that happens every week between Christmas and New Year's. So really trying to respond to what the community needed. Reno has a wonderful and thriving Philharmonic Orchestra, which actually I believe is the biggest performing arts organization in the state of Nevada. And has 4 youth orchestras, and is a really, it's sort of the LA Phil to the LA Chamber Orchestra, both wonderful, but one of them is a whole lot bigger. And so that's the duality. And many of us play in both orchestras and are completely committed. And so, I was coming to it with an approach of, what's best for our overall community. So we have a wonderful, thriving chamber orchestra that plays that repertoire in a different concert hall. The Philharmonic plays, the university has wonderful offerings. And so it wasn't a turf war. It was how do we play our part to offer the community a rich and diverse offering.
Yeah. And I have always been amazed that Reno, because we don't think of Reno as like a huge city, right? Mm-hmm. And they actually have a more robust art scene in some ways than Las Vegas. Las Vegas has other things, like we have cirque shows and we have other things that other cities don't have. But like when it comes to like performing arts, you guys have 2 orchestras, which seems amazing to me for a town your size.
And both of them, the Phil is going into its next year's the 55th season, and the RCO is coming up on 50 years. So we've existed a long time. There was a thriving opera company for years that was about that old as well. We've had 2 ballet companies. And part of it's the Nevada phenomenon. We had dancers that were here for the shows. And so then some of them stayed and, kept doing that. And then we had showroom musicians. The Philharmonic used to play all of our concerts on Tuesday nights because that was the dark night for the showrooms. And so the players could play. So that's why the local orchestra had Tuesday concerts. And, just interesting realities of our, Vegas has the similar, kinds of traditions. But historically, that was where a lot of our really solid, great musicians came from. The Reno Chamber Orchestra was essentially started by a group of string players who were playing whole notes for Sammy Davis Jr. every night and wanted to do what they had done. One of the violinists, Vahe Kochayan, was a conductor from Tehran originally. And so he said, I can conduct. They had some parts, got together at the Union Hall. And they started playing, and it was completely organic group of musicians who started that 48 years ago. Just a really interesting thing. And as I was mentioning before we came on the air, that I came here 29 years ago for grad school, and I thought, I'll be here for 2 years. And then I found this really rich, wonderful community. And culturally, there are, players that have no business being here and should be in New York and LA, but they choose to live here because it's wonderful. And there's really a lot of positives to it. So.
Yeah, that's great. I know that we have some really interesting things happening in Las Vegas. I have a wind orchestra that I play with. That's actually mostly a volunteer group, but it's so good, and the conductor is so good that I'm supporting them because I'm like, I want this group to grow. But yeah, I hope that we can get up there. But I think Las Vegas isn't quite as old as Reno, which might be why our city isn't as built up that way.
Could be. They're both unique, and Las Vegas, there is no place like it in the world. So yeah, for sure.
So I would like to ask you a couple provocative questions, I guess. So what in both wearing both hats, what do you wish that musicians understood or appreciated more about arts managers that they don't?
Oh, good question. Off the top of my head, and I think actually Henry Fogel, who used to run the League of American Orchestras and the Chicago Symphony and other things, one of the grand old men of the field, he said something like, I never hired an administrative employee for the purpose of making the organization less strong. So, very often you'll hear musicians might say, oh, well, look at all the money they're spending on staff. Well, they're not just hired so that there can be another administrative person. It's for the purpose of supporting the entire organization and ultimately what is put on the stage. And so I do think that sometimes musicians forget the fact that the staff is there to support their work and to make it possible and to make it happen. And it's not just something on a budget that takes dollars out of their bucket.
Yeah, that's very true. And Henry Fogel had a great quote that I love, which is about managers, which is that nobody comes and claps to see you manage. Like,
yeah. No one ever applauded to see me run a meeting. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. He's a great leader in the field, and this has been really transformative. So what do you? I'm going to ask the reverse. What do you wish that boards and managers understood about musicians, and appreciated that maybe they don't?
Just how much it takes, that it does take a lifetime to get to be able to play like this. And that, we're often treated like cogs in a wheel and sort of replaceable labor. And yet we're a whole lot closer to being skilled surgeons. And, both with the amount of time we put into it, education, including educational costs, all the rest. And so we are absolute specialists, but just by nature of the fact that there's 30 to 80 or however many people on stage, we come across as sort of rank and file specialists and surgeons. And I think that sometimes boards and administrations forget or don't realize just the sort of talent pool. And then if you get an egotistical person on the podium that says, this is my world, and they're all, if it wasn't for me, they could do nothing. And that's the person that the board listens to. There's all kinds of dynamics to this, but I think that I think that orchestras have, I won't say it negatively, I'll say it positively. I think as we look to the future, there is a huge brain trust and resource in the musicians of the orchestra that we haven't done as well as we might in capitalizing and tapping into that. Sometimes musicians are crazy like everybody else, and they have ideas that are off the wall that wouldn't work for a million reasons. But there's a lot of really smart, really talented, really devoted and caring people that need to be part of this. I fear that sometimes we get siloed, and so the musicians are here, and then the board is here, and the administration is there, and I think consciously and continuously, breaking down those walls and really trying to build a culture where everyone is marching in the same direction is more crucial than ever. And as the world changes so fast, and as what we do for many people becomes less and less relevant, I think that it's just crucial that we are all working together, because if we're not, it's going to be hard enough anyway.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more. And I think I'm thinking about just my own recent experience where I got hired by the Las Vegas Phil to play this John Williams concert, which was like the greatest music to me. It was why I started to play my instrument. Yeah. But, I think boards and managers and audiences, sometimes they just think that like it's a talent and you just turn it on and off. But it's much more like being an athlete. And I mean, if I didn't have, thank God I got the call in advance. Like, I mean, I was practicing and teaching and stuff, but like it took me 2 weeks to get in shape for that concert.
That's hard music. Yeah.
It's hard music, right? Yeah. And so I think that sometimes people don't understand that the performance is just the top of the iceberg, but there's all this work that goes into getting in shape and being at that level.
Absolutely. And we can do better. Musicians, but also boards and management. I mean, we did it we didn't do it all the time in the RCO board meetings, but we'd often start with a musical moment, and we'd bring in, a bassoonist to show them reeds, or just, something to break those things down and make those connections. And so, our Paul Lenz, our principal trumpet, brought in 5 trumpets and showed why he has to change and what that means and what it does, and just stuff that for lots of people it just never would occur to them. And we can really do a service. And frankly, board members who are wonderful, devoted community volunteers, paying for the privilege of being legally responsible for our organizations. That's a real treat for them to get to be around musicians and to get to sort of see under the hood. And so I think we can do things like that really easily for no money that are a huge benefit to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important because there is this disconnect, and managers, they often don't, attend rehearsals or something even that simple where they would get a more direct experience of what we're doing as musicians.
Right. And I'm a big fan of board members and management coming to rehearsals. If you're the executive director of an orchestra, and I understand there's different sizes and different things going on, but as a general rule, in regional orchestras where we rehearse at night, orchestra weeks are orchestra weeks, and you ought to be there. It's a great time to meet your musicians, to have that sort of, out of negotiation interaction, because, agreements are really figured out between agreements, not at the table, or they should be, because if you only talk to your musicians at the table, it probably won't go well. And then also bringing board members to rehearsal too, so that they can have that sort of connection and behind the scenes, I think is only to the good.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something earlier which reminded me of something that I found out when John McCann was a guest on my show.
Mm-hmm.
And he mentioned that the arts in general are pretty low on the totem pole of giving priorities for whatever reason now. Mm-hmm. That people like artists, they like them in their community, but when it came to like giving, like what do you think is most important? The arts are not reaching the high. Do you find that over the years that you've been in Reno, that has it been harder to raise money because people are not prioritizing the arts, or how do you manage that? Is that a reality for you that you've experienced, I guess?
Yeah, and I will say, I stepped down as executive director, it's amazing to say, 8 years ago. So, and the big part of that is that I didn't manage through COVID and after COVID. So, I think that the philanthropic landscape has shifted, pretty dynamically in that amount of time. But I will say, and I think that this has always been true, and the cliche is that people give to people, but when arts and music touch a person's life and you have a true connection with a person, and it's true for all of us, that's when we want to give of ourselves, give of our resources, really contribute to it. So perhaps if that change that John mentioned is happening, it may be because we haven't been doing a good enough job of connecting the miraculous thing that we do and bring to the world with the lives that are out there that could really use what we do. Because music is a powerful, wonderful thing. It's why we all got into it in the first place. And we have to always be mindful of that. And then we absolutely have to be ambassadors and crusaders in the world to bring that to folks. Then, there's a million layered questions of what people do you want to do that to? And should you go after just the people with the biggest checkbooks and blah, blah, blah. But I think we need to be, and I think this was John Limbacher's line, something like, we need to be more meaningful to more people. Yeah. And I think if we approach it like that, that will go up. But if we're not relevant, there's no hope. It used to be that good members of society understood, we need an orchestra, we need the arts, we'll just contribute because it's the right thing to do. My parents did it, I'll do it. Here, give me my subscription. And those days are gone.
Yeah, that's so true. So when I don't know if you have an answer to the question, but like when you think about how do we become more relevant, like what the things that I'm thinking of that are coming to my mind are some of the orchestras that were very creative during COVID, where and unions too, right? We had a local in Philadelphia that said, look, we need to use our Music Performance Trust Fund to give concerts online, because we need to keep our musicians connected to our community. And then I think some really creative orchestras were doing the same thing as well. Yeah. And I think in some ways, I don't know, because I'm not in the world of it, but like I wonder if post COVID, like people had a different experience of going to a live concert, right? Because it was kind of like off the table for 2 years. Yeah. And then you come back and you're like, wow, I really miss this. Like, this is really what this is about, because there's nothing like a live performance, whether it's an opera or a symphony or a ballet or a theater.
Exactly. And that shared experience is crucial. I think, one thing in the orchestra world, the classical music world, we've done ourselves a huge disservice over the years with all of the sort of unimportant trappings, wearing tuxedos, when to clap, all of the different stuff that are sort of built-in barriers for some people who might love what we do, but they don't even get to the starting line, because I've heard people say, I can't go to the orchestra because I don't own a tuxedo. And they thought you had to wear one to go. And so just stupid stuff like that. So I think, and I think a lot of orchestras are working to break down barriers. And I think starting with the kinds of things you were talking about with video and with different stuff, breaking those unnecessary barriers and impediments, I think, is crucial. And also going to the people, as opposed to just sort of saying, come to our fancy concert hall that you may not have ever been to, and meeting folks where they're at. I think is something that is crucial. And and also maybe not expecting too much of it. Certainly, going into the schools, just showing that the people that this is there, that this is a help. And also I think representation is really important, so that, kids perhaps from, communities or races, ethnicities that haven't historically been as involved, see people that's like, wow, she looks like me, and maybe I could be a violinist, or, those kinds of seeds. I think that's really important, because if you have in your head about anything, oh, that doesn't apply to me, that's not me, then why would you pay any attention to it? So I think that our field is just now really starting to dig into this work, and it's a lot of big work, but it's super important, and we will not survive in the way that we have, or we will not survive if we don't get better at it.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and I also think that there is this barrier that we put up ourselves, really, and it has to do with the history and the nature of our work. Like, we do not want anybody to see us make a mistake. So we don't actually engage with the audience until we have a final product to show them. But when you think about like what people get involved with actors or celebrities or pop singers, they know about their lives, and they've seen them be vulnerable, and they've seen all these and we just don't do that in the classical world. We don't have any interaction or engagement until we're like presenting a final product. And I think that creates some sort of distance, because people are like, they only see the finished product. They don't see all the rest of the stuff.
The process, yeah. And there are some places. I played in the La Musica Chamber Music Festival in Sarasota, Florida, a few times, and they actually have open rehearsals, so people can go and see the working process. And it's wonderful. And of course, it's an interesting thing for music lovers to get to see, sort of how it progresses. And so I think that groups should do more of that. And, we also have, it's interesting you talk about being perfect, because in classical music especially, we have an interesting and probably unhealthy relationship with perfection, whatever that is. And starting with the audition process. Go behind the curtain, take off all your musical clothes, and have a perfect physique. Essentially, don't miss anything. It's all about not missing. The audition process, and it has served a lot of purposes, and is not a completely flawed process, but it has some things that it just can't test for. And so I think that just even from the starting of how to get a job in an orchestra, it's about playing perfectly.
Yeah. And it's really, if you're in that perfection head, it's very hard to think, about making music in an audition, because you're just so concerned about technical.
Right.
Perfection.
Yeah. I've told students, I said, keep in mind that the panel gets to listen to you, and, go in there excited to share with them. And like, to have that mindset for an audition is, it's like, of course, that's how I come to a performance. But, for an audition, it's like, okay, just don't mess up, get the crescendo, all the little micro stuff that has nothing to do with actually nothing to do with ultimately what the power of music is.
Yeah. It's really a brutal meritocracy in a lot of ways, the audition process.
Yeah.
And it's completely artificial, right? Like you're playing music without anybody else, that's out of context compared to what you would hear in a full concert. And
right, which is the skill of playing in an orchestra, is what do you do when the soloist goes left, the conductor drops a beat, and your stand partner is rushing? That's the job. It's not right. How perfectly can you play with your metronome?
Right, exactly. So now, are you still playing in both the Reno Chamber Orchestra and the Reno Phil?
I am. Yep.
Great. And has your perspective changed now that you're not managing anything? You're just a player now.
Yeah, and in the Philharmonic, I was never management, so I always enjoyed those weeks, because I could just, when I was in the chamber orchestra, I was executive director and a bass player in the section, and so all of the fires that were going on, all of the potential fires were going on in my head in real time, and that was pretty tough. We figured it out, but I really realized that the big challenge for me in playing and managing the same orchestra was between my ears. I needed to tune out or tune into the music as well as I could, as quickly as I could, because very often I would come, warm up 2 hours before the concert, leave my bass on stage, go greet patrons, put out fires, walk on stage, give some opening remarks, pick up my instrument and hope it was in tune, and we're off.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a weird thing. It's like if you imagine the coach of the football team who's also playing on the team. Like, it's almost impossible to think about managing all those, juggling all those balls in your
yeah,
head.
and it worked for me. I will say that being executive director and playing, a person couldn't do it in a much larger organization. I think it would just be too tough. One thing I did say to the conductor when we hired Ted Kuchar, the first day I said, look, if it's ever uncomfortable for me, for you, that I'm in your orchestra as a player, just tell me I don't want this. That never happened, but I just put that out there from day one, that he could be comfortable to just say, I'd rather you didn't play in the orchestra. And then I also have had, there's one other colleague I'm thinking of who's a fine violist, and he was executive director of a regional orchestra, and he subbed in the viola section. They needed someone to play, and he was happy to do it. And his board chair took him aside and said, essentially, I don't like the optics of our CEO being sort of in, rank and file musician, and that bugged me for a million reasons. But but that was something that was out there too, was that this needs to be a separation there. So I don't think it would work for everyone to play and be the executive director or the CEO of the orchestra, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. I've heard of other like small orchestras, like Pensacola had somebody doing that for a few years. And there's probably other examples as well. It's definitely a skill set that not many have, I think.
Yeah, and it really, we were talking about this earlier, it really does, it makes it essential that you break down barriers, because like I said, there's no us and them in my life. It's just sort of both at all times. And sometimes my brain would toggle back and forth, and I'd be a disgruntled musician or a disgruntled manager, but it was in the same head.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'm looking back on my own experience, where I worked for the League of American Orchestras for a few years, and
which is where you and I met.
Yes, exactly. And we were part of a very interesting program called Ford Made in America. And, I was thinking about, the musicians who just come there and they see this piece of music on their stand, and they have no idea of like all that went into getting it there, right? And your orchestra premiered it, right? You gave the world premiere of
Joseph Schwantner's piece "Chasing Light."
Yes, exactly. And I don't know how I've always wanted to talk to you about this, because it was such an interesting and challenging project, because Joseph Schwantner was like the sweetest man in the whole world. And he's a really amazing composer. And he followed the dictates of the commission while also writing an almost unplayable piece for certain chairs. and I'm like, oh my God, we have all these tiny orchestras around the country that are playing this. And, people were complaining about how hard it was. How did you guys, like, just knowing that you're giving the premiere, like, what does the conductor say to you at that first rehearsal? Like, where you're thinking about how you're going to deliver this piece that's, there's so much weight on it, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, the musicians really stepped up. We had played Ford Made in America, for those people that aren't familiar with the program, was the brainchild of a small group of orchestra managers led by a man named Bob Rosoff in Glens Falls, New York. And his idea essentially was big orchestras can commission major composers to write works, but small budget orchestras can't. And so we built a consortium, and this snowballed, and the Ford Motor Company fund came on and funded it and said, yes, we'll give you a lot of money for this, but we want at least one orchestra in all 50 states. And so we got an orchestra in all 50 states to play Joan Tower's piece entitled Made in America. And it was a wonderful thing. She came out and conducted the West Coast premiere of the piece with us. And that was a wonderful experience. And then as that was going on, that's when we said and the league said we need to do round two. And so then that was when Schwantner was brought on, and it was decided that we would do the premiere in Reno. And so there was a lot of momentum that was built partly because I was chairing the committee and I made it clear to all the people in the organization what a big deal this was. Sometimes, if that communication doesn't happen, then musicians might just think, oh, it's another hard new piece. This is weird. And not buy in the same kind of way. And Schwantner was amazing to work with. And he had me send recordings of the orchestra to him so he could hear our individual players. So sort of like how Duke Ellington wrote for Johnny Hodges and, Juan Teasel and the guys in the band, Schwantner wrote for our orchestra. And there's, in our house, one of the legendary stories. My wife, Andrea Lenz, was our principal oboist. And so I told her about these conversations I was having with Joe. And she said, sarcastically one morning at breakfast, well, tell him to write a good oboe solo. And so I was on the phone that afternoon. I said, my wife, Andrea, is our principal oboe. She says, write a good oboe solo. Well, the entire slow movement at the top of the page, it says for Andrea, and it's an extended oboe cadenza, and it's just amazing. So he literally wrote it for her, and that's in the score for all time. And
that's great.
So there were those kinds of personal connections and ties. But one thing, and when Joan Tower was in town, she said, Scott, in her voice, Scott, I feel like a rock star. Because, she was said, sometimes I go to a big city and I sit in the hotel room. I come out and bow at the end. Somebody drives me to the airport, or I, submit my receipt for the cab. And she said, here at the parties, because we had talked it up, it was a big deal because this doesn't happen all the time in our community. And so in some ways, it was really special. And so, in terms of creating new music and composers we've brought over the years for both Reno Phil and Reno Chamber Orchestra, they have really had meaningful experiences because it meant something to the community.
Yeah, and I think that was a really special part of that program, was the community engagement aspects of it that were built into it. And it's a great piece of music, I have to say. Chasing Light's a wonderful piece. Have you all played it since, or has it been played much after that commission?
We have not. As you said, it's a hard piece. So it hasn't been played much. I know that the Joan Towers piece, Made in America, has been played a few times. But I don't think Nashville recorded it. And so there's a CD of it, but I don't know if it's been performed much.
Yeah. And I think they wanted to do another round, and I don't know. I think they ended up morphing into something else. But
actually, we did. And there's a group we've started called New Music for America, and we commissioned Christopher Thifanides to write a piece called Dreamtime Ancestors, which was played by a number of orchestras, not quite so many. And that was a few years ago, probably 5 years ago, six or so, whatever, time. And then right now, there are a number of orchestras that are playing Jennifer Higdon's Cold Mountain Suite. And we commissioned her to write the suite from her opera Cold Mountain. And so it is essentially, there have now been 4 Made in America-ish pieces with the same kind of, many of the same people on the steering committee. And so.
That's fascinating. I was talking to you earlier about the fact that I play with this group, Desert Winds, here in Las Vegas. And, in that world of wind ensembles, they have to commission new music because there's just not a lot. Right. You can't play, Sousa all the time or some of that stuff. So, but it seems like the band world, especially at the university levels, has gotten pretty good at consortium commissions of like 3 or 4 different universities. And some of the work that's being written for wind ensemble is pretty spectacular now. And one of my favorite composers actually wrote very little, if anything, for orchestra. His name was David Maslenka, and he's written amazing music for band. But I wish that the Jennifer Higdons of the world would write more for our ensemble as well in the wind orchestra world. Yeah,
it's interesting because in Reno we've had a couple of really the Reno Phil has had a couple of very successful commissions recently. A piece by Joe Tien a few years ago called Transcend, and it was about the Transcontinental Railroad, which goes through Reno, and actually our city wouldn't exist without the Transcontinental Railroad. And so this is a piece that we put together, a consortium of orchestras, most of them along the railroad. So starting in Iowa, outside of the Omaha Orchestra, which is about where it started, and then going through Wyoming and to us, and then also, and ending up ultimately Sacramento and San Francisco. And so that was a really kind of powerful piece to have this Chinese American composer write a piece that really paid homage to the folks, especially here in the Sierra Mountains, who died building this railroad. And so there were all kinds of interesting social connections and a great piece of music. The San Francisco Symphony just played it on their Asian New Year concert a month or two ago, I think. And so that was a big success. I think we had 13 or 14 orchestras that played that. And then right now, actually in a couple of weeks, the Boise Philharmonic is going to play a piece that we commissioned and gave the premiere of called Altered Landscape by Jimmy Lopez Bellido. And a wonderful, interesting work that deals and written during the pandemic. So it deals with the pandemic moment. It deals with humanity's footprint on the earth, issues of climate, and an interesting partnership that we made with the Nature Conservancy, where orchestras that play the piece don't pay a commissioning fee because we got generous donors to pay for it, but they have to make a contribution to the Nature Conservancy and pay it forward so that there can be good work done on behalf of the environment in their community.
Wow, that's a really great example of using our art form to have an impact on our community outside music, right?
Yeah, and it's been successful. We would like for more orchestras to play the piece. Our music director, Laura Jackson, is conducting the work with the Buffalo Phil, but we'd still love for other orchestras to sign on and play it.
That's great. So one of our I don't see who's the comment that says, somebody said, love David Maslenka, would love to play Jennifer Higdon's Wee music. I don't know that piece of hers, but
I don't know.
WE, not sure. Huh. But yeah, Maslenka is a great composer. And I do think we're seeing in the composition and commissioning world a more intentional orientation toward how do we make an impact and how do we reflect all the people in our community and all the stories in our community. And I think that's not been traditional, but it's been great.
Exactly. Yeah. And I will say, when a person looks at repertoire being played, I say wind ensemble.
Yeah. I figured that out.
that very happily orchestras are playing much more music by women, people of color, composers who are worthy of being played and have been worthy of being played, but haven't. And so I'm really grateful and glad to see that happening.
Yeah, me too. And I think there has been some polemical arguments, and I'm not necessarily opposed to it either. Like maybe we shouldn't play Beethoven for 5 years. Like I don't know. Like there's even today there's still every orchestra. You see a Tchaikovsky symphony, you see Beethoven, you see Brahms, and it's not that they're not great pieces, but it's like how much do we need to keep playing them over and over and over again?
Yeah. And it is a tricky thing about also just sort of the culture and the structures of our organization, because if you play Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you will sell a bunch of tickets and make your budget and stuff like that. And so to say, hey, here's a really worthy young composer you've never heard of, come roll the dice on this piece. And classical music, the League years ago did a study, and I think Jack McAuliffe was the person that identified what he called the familiarity spiral. I think it was that with classical music, the more you listen to it, the more you want to listen to it, the more you want to listen to it. And so it's interesting to me that with classical music, as opposed to other art forms, with movies, people will say, oh no, I don't want to see that, I've already seen it. Nobody ever says that about Beethoven. It's the opposite. They say, oh, I want to hear Beethoven because I love Beethoven. It's like, well, do you want to hear it? No, because I haven't heard it. And so it's interesting that our art form is about hearing it again, not about a bias toward checking out the new.
That's really fascinating. I never thought of it that way, but it's so true. Yeah. And, but I also think that there is something that the audiences and the boards don't realize, which is that we can't just not play Beethoven and Brahms and Tchaikovsky, because those pieces are actually really essential in raising the artistic level of the orchestra.
Yeah.
That we have to play those to keep our skills up and to keep that sense of an orchestral sound. And if we don't play Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms, and only play new music. We're a different ensemble at that point.
It is a different thing, and it really is our language. And I mean, as you know, as a player, when you get a thorny new piece that really is a new language to learn, of course, it's not going to be as fluent and easy, and certainly it'll be harder to prepare quite often. But then also just putting it together and being comfortable with it. I mean, to go hear the Chicago Symphony play Brahms, it's like, this makes sense. This makes sense. And not that they can't play any repertoire that's out there, but it really is true. And so then also very often, with limited rehearsal time, a new piece will get shortchanged with rehearsal time. So it actually won't be played as well as it might have. It'll be unfamiliar. I always feel like audiences have it the worst, because as a musician, you get to live with a piece for a week. You get to practice it. You get to hear it a few times, get those connections. And, the stock may go up, it may go down. You might end up not liking it at the end of the week, but at least you've lived with it and digested it. They get to come in, plop down, listen to it once, and have a reaction to it. I mean, some places I've heard that people will play a piece twice if it's not too long. And I really think that's actually not a bad idea at all, because, for an audience member that maybe didn't have time to read the program note, to get a point of entry, I think that, those points of entry are really crucial to people getting to know and understand new music.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I love that idea of playing something twice. I mean, I remember an experience where I was at a music festival, and I had the time and the willingness of our ensemble. And we spent a long time, maybe a week, just learning one movement of a wind quintet by Arnold Schoenberg. Mm-hmm. And it was an early, really, truly 12-tone piece of his, yeah. And atonal. And I was like, during the whole week, I'm like, oh, this is so cool, because I see where this melody and this motive comes back and stuff. And then I listened to the recording later, and I was like, I don't hear any of that as a listener, like none of it.
Right. And so it's not a fair fight in that way.
Yeah, not at all. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your work with the League of American Orchestras now. And you are now the director of the Essentials in Orchestra Management program. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about that program. You mentioned it earlier as the first thing that you got that really taught you how to some of the essentials of doing your job, and now you're leading the whole program.
Yeah, and this seminar, there have been sort of versions of it decades back in the League of American Orchestras. For those who aren't familiar with it, is the National Association of Orchestras, and I'm not sure what the number is. I think it's something like 1,000 orchestras in America that are out there, and it's a wonderful organization. And this program is to help train managers, and certainly it's evolved over the years. When I took it in 2002, I would say it was much more sort of how to run a railroad. And with all of the changes in our world now, it's shifted more to how to think about running a railroad. And certainly there are still, it's a 10-day boot camp. So all of the sort of big subjects are there. So you learn about finance, you learn about marketing, you learn about orchestral operations, you learn about artistic administration and governance, and sort of all of those parts. And it's for early career folks. Sometimes they're junior people in bigger orchestras, or maybe first or second year executive directors of smaller orchestras. Some people who are looking to maybe make a career change. Actually, this last year, we had a couple of musicians in major full-time orchestras that were in the seminar, learning about and exploring the possibility of what the next step of their career and phase might look. So we have a core faculty of 3 people right now. It's myself and Alex Lang, who's the wonderful principal clarinet of the Phoenix Symphony, and Jennifer Barlament, the CEO of the Atlanta Symphony. And then we have another 20 or 25 adjunct faculty who come in to talk specifically on their subject. And this has really been a transformative experience for a lot of people, and myself included. Also another thing that we have done is to start a League Alumni Association. There's over 700 alumni from these programs over the years, and they've never been sort of organized in any kind of a way. And so we've started that, and that's been a great kind of extension and connection for lots of folks around our field. And, both for job references, things like that, but also for mentoring and for peer connections and that. So it's been wonderful. But Essentials happens in late July, early August at Juilliard. We were in Los Angeles on the USC campus for a number of years, and then just this last year moved to Juilliard, and that's now our host and home, and it's been wonderful. So we'll be back in Juilliard this summer, and applications are still open. So if anyone's interested, they can go to the League of American Orchestras website, look for Essentials of Orchestra Management, and apply. Last year we had 85 applicants for 35 spots, and so very competitive. The class was just an amazing group of people, mostly youngish, I would say, sort of mid to late 20s, and really devoted, really committed to the future of the orchestras, and frankly, with not much interest in just doing things the way we've always done them, and with a lot of energy and momentum for making the big changes in our field that need to happen. And actually, a lot of people are sort of pessimistic about the arts and about orchestras and music, but coming out of Essentials, at least with these people, I'm not, because there are some really amazing, wonderful, energetic folks that are out there in the world that are already doing great work and will continue to.
That's great. And, we met through my connection with the League, and I went through their fellowship program, and I think Essentials was part of that program. We actually had to come into New York for several days of
right. Yeah. And the fellowship program, the Essentials of Orchestra Management, something called Emerging Leaders Program. The League has had different leadership and learning type programs, and this alumni network brings all of those folks together.
That's great. And so it's leagueofamericanorchestras.org. It's
it's americanorchestras.org.
Americanorchestras.org. Okay. Yeah. So look for that, americanorchestras.org, if you're interested in either the Essentials or the fellowship program, which is a great program as well.
And actually, the fellowship program at the moment is dormant. So that's okay. So there is something that they're launching this year, and I believe applications have closed. But there was a wonderful orchestra manager named Ann Parsons, who ran the Detroit Symphony, and she recently passed away from cancer. And to honor her and her memory, they have started the Ann Parsons Women Leadership Program. So it's for women and gender fluid. I'm not sure what the right term is. Non-male. Folks to learn and be mentored with orchestra management and that. So those are sort of the two big programs right now in terms of management and leadership through the League.
That's great. I had a really, I did go through the fellowship program, and I had, it was fascinating to me, but it was something about it that was like, I was like, I don't know if this is really the right path for me. And what I found was that I was missing making music, that I couldn't substitute my love for music and translate it into management totally. Yeah. So I would have probably been successful maybe doing what you did as a player manager. But I just remember that I was just feeling like the closer I got to people like, musician leaders and musicians in the orchestras that I was working with, conductors, composers like Joseph Faulkner, like the more I missed being on stage and the more I missed playing. Yeah. So it was a really interesting time for me.
Yeah. And that sort of, self-learning and self-awareness, know thyself, it really is what you have to do, because I think as musicians, lots of times, especially, we study, we work, we practice, we take auditions, and then maybe it doesn't work out. And sometimes it's, for whatever reason, sometimes the universe just doesn't have that in mind, perhaps. But it's so, I think it's easy for a musician, if the performance career doesn't work out for whatever reason, to consider themselves a failure or having failed. But for some folks, it might just not be quite the right thing. And that's okay too, to say, you know what, I can play music, but maybe for whatever reason, I am interested in doing this other thing. Or in your case, I can manage, but I need to have that music in my life. And so finding that balance, and for some folks, it might be a job in management where they find a community orchestra or the wind ensemble you're playing in that brings you joy. It allows you to do your thing and still play music, but also do both. In my case, it happened to be being executive director and playing in my orchestra. But I think for lots of folks, there are jobs in orchestras that you can do as a player. I mean, certainly personnel manager is one that is often occupied by a player in the orchestra. And so for a person that's organized, that knows lots of folks, that can, do that job, it can be a great, a great addition to a person, what they do. Certainly some things like working the ticket booth or, those kinds of jobs would be too hard to do if you also were playing, but you could do some orchestral operations, library work, that kind of thing. There are ways to get into the management side of things and still keep playing, whether in your orchestra or another one.
Yeah, that's so true. And I had a friend who left music entirely. He had a very different path than me, and he was playing clarinet in the Omaha Symphony and just decided, I don't want to do this anymore. And he wanted to be a meteorologist first. That didn't work out. He didn't really have the chops for the physics and all this. But then he ended up going into therapy, and he's a really successful therapist now in New York City. And he said, well, look, this is just as creative as music. Like the problem solving and the stuff that I'm doing with my clients is a creative outlet for me. And I don't miss music, right? Like sure. He put his clarinets away and didn't go back. Some people do that too. I could never do that. But
and that's really interesting, and as an orchestral player, especially as an orchestral string player, where there are lots of people on my part, I find that that's often not my most creative moments in life. I write a blog for our local PBS station and did for the newspaper for a number of years. And for me, the writing was much more creative than the orchestral playing part. I mean, chamber music, sometimes, there's more ability to sort of be musically creative in that moment. But ironically, perhaps, I mean, because I get what your clarinet player friend is saying about creativity, because ironically, sometimes orchestras are not the place to be creative. They're the place to be, perfectly homogenous.
Yeah. And I often say, music, like being a performing artist is not the most creative thing. You're right. And if you, being a composer, being a choreographer, a director, a writer, obviously, those are creative outlets. But what we do is much more similar to athletics, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And we are interpretive. I mean, we can take a text and make it better, but I think that's exactly right. And so for some people, that just have this idea that if you're making a musical sound, it's 100% creative. That's a myth that isn't right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending all your time with us this morning, Scott. And how do people connect with you personally? Can they find you on LinkedIn or Facebook if they want to ask you any questions?
Yeah, both of those places would be happy to chat if people have specific questions. And thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And don't forget to look also for the essentials of orchestra management at americanorchestras.org. And thank you so much, Scott, for spending your Saturday morning with us. And we will see everybody next time.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone that tuned in today.
All right. Take care.